and welcome to the CX Files podcast for February 24th, 2022. My name is Mark Hillary and I'm in Sao Paulo, Brazil.
And a very good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you might be. I'm Peter Ryan in Montreal, Canada.
Well, this week, Peter, we're talking with Paula Kennedy Garcia from Concentrix. Now, Paula's based in Belfast, and she's the Vice President for Global Innovation at Concentrix, which is why she's been on the podcast before in her role running the Solve Gig CX product. But I know that she's also now the Global Head of Trust and Safety for Concentrix, and I believe this is why you spoke to her for this interview.
Yeah, absolutely, Mark. And as you've mentioned, Paula has been a guest on our podcast in the past, and a very good guest. Always comes to the table with some really innovative views and, quite frankly, isn't afraid to call a spade a spade. What I think is interesting, though, is the extent to which trust and safety has really come to the forefront of the CX domain, whether it's in relation to agent safety, whether it's in relation to exposure of individuals who are users or consumers to elements that perhaps are of the more nefarious side. But this has really emerged as, I think, probably one of the most important topics as we moved into 2022. And Paula came to the podcast in the interview that our listeners are going to hear with, I think, not just some incredibly interesting views on the broader trends when it comes to trust and safety, but also, I think, some of the challenges that are faced not just by individuals on the front line that are involved in content moderation, but also from the standpoint of perhaps a more strategic level in terms of thinking about how best to manage some of these challenges and how to ensure the long-term mental wellness of individuals that are performing these moderation roles.
Yeah, and I think there's a number of different angles that are really interesting. In the interview, I heard Paula talking about brand protection, protecting the value of your brand, because I think we often see this as just a social media problem. What are people uploading to YouTube or Facebook or whatever? But now so many companies are allowing user-generated content, things like product reviews or comments on products that people are selling. So all e-commerce companies are at risk here as well, because if you go browsing for some fashion and then suddenly there's a whole load of porn or terrorist content that's been uploaded to that e-commerce vendor, that's completely going to ruin the reputation and the user experience of someone who encounters that kind of stuff.
Exactly. And it just goes to show, I think, how multifaceted this issue of trust and safety really is. As you say, I think there's an association that many people have that this is a social media challenge or a social media problem, when the reality is that this is pervasive across a whole series of different forums, across different channels. And that's something that I talked to Paula about, the extent to which this is a cross-channel issue and the extent to which individuals who might be supporting web chat, that might be handling email, that might be doing instant messaging, are equally as vulnerable as those who are handling social media.
And I think that the conversation you had with her about the employee care and the duty of care for the employees that are involved in this, that is another really important area, because there's also an assumption that AI can just do all of this. But I think that the reality is that AI can identify maybe 99% of this stuff that's being uploaded. Yeah. But that means that the 1% has to go to a human to be verified. And so those humans that are getting a constant feed of stuff that needs to be checked are pretty much just seeing a constant diet of awful content. So these guys and girls need looking after.
They do need looking after, and the extent to which that people are able to digest this content, the extent to which they're able to rationalize it in their own mind and handle it in an objective way is one thing. And then dealing with the fallout, dealing with the PTSD afterwards is something completely different. And they do require a huge duty of care, which is why I think it's great that people like Paula are in positions where they're going to be able to handle this type of a role, where they're going to be able to handle this type of a challenge, because honestly, it requires thoughtful people with long-term vision and a good understanding, a realistic understanding about what needs to be done in order to keep agents safe. And that's really the crux of what we were getting at over the course of our chat with Paula.
Okay, so let's go to your discussion with Paula Kennedy Garcia from Concentrix. And this is all focused on trust and safety in CX.
The CX Files is really fortunate this week to have Paula Kennedy Garcia with us from Concentrix to talk a little bit about trust and safety. Paula, thanks for taking some time to spend with the CX Files today.
Oh, I'm delighted. Thank you for having me again.
Well, the pleasure is all ours. And I would really like to start with a discussion around why trust and safety has become such a big thing. You know, I would dare say that maybe 6 months ago, when we were in the throes of summer 2021, this was an expression that very few people in the CX industry or otherwise would be aware of. Why has it emerged as such a big challenge and such a big element of discussion in the realm of contact centers and contact center delivery the last couple of months?
I'm really pleased that it has. And honestly, put simply, Peter, the problem of online safety, online trust, online accuracy of information, it's just much bigger than it used to be. I mean, online support, be it messaging and email or social media, customer care, all of that is now fully integrated into what is a standard CX ecosystem in a digital environment, right? But any online presence has harm exposure somewhere in that ecosystem. And very, very often it's subtle and it's not assumed as an issue until something goes wrong. And customers are now being exposed to an abundance of new and potentially unsafe content just by simply logging online. So to protect consumers and establish a safe kind of environment digitally, companies really do need to prioritize trust and safety, because it's not just an issue of videos with acts of violence online. We are talking about disinformation campaigns, advanced types of fraud and identity theft, misuse of gaming or e-commerce platforms with non-compliant goods. I mean, the list goes on. And there are all things that frontline support staff can encounter in their daily jobs. So I think it's important that it has that presence. We talk a lot about false information, but if you step back and think about just what that range of stuff is and what it can lead to, it effectively is dangerous content, which can cause real world harm. And you were just speaking about what's happening in Ottawa, right? But think about disinformation such as the 2016 US elections, right? The political groups, the governments all set out to hijack online conversations. And then COVID and the pandemic comes along, and the viral rise of medical misinformation and anti-vax, that creates real world harm. And you add into that conspiracy thinking and QAnon and hate speech and online fraud, like there's just so much. And in fact, there's just new ways keep coming up almost daily for trust and safety issues. And the good news is they're getting more focus than ever from users, from governments, from activists, and also, as you can imagine, from the platforms, which means it really does require the same level of focus from those of us who provide online support services of any type, so that we can build valuable long-term customer relationships.
So then really what we're saying here, Paula, is that it's essential for any CX environment to incorporate trust and safety provisions into its operations moving forward.
I think so. I mean, this issue is real and it has huge scale. So I think it's very important. Brands are much more focused on the role of harm to their reputation, and customers also, and they want CX expertise to share that focus. So digital experiences can make or break long-term customer value on long-term customer experiences. And indeed, I read a report this week which was sharing that I think almost a third of customers are actively reading user-generated feedback on social network sites, on websites before they purchase, somewhere like Facebook and Twitter, before they buy a product. So that means that any unsafe or misleading content can have a material impact on everything that happens between the customer and that brand thereafter. But the challenge is that many are in reactive mode still, because designing for harm is not something that's typically featured early enough still in product or process UX design. So policies, protocols, they just might not exist, and it needs really in-depth understanding for those to be created. So for brands, it's really important for brands to spot the difference between legitimate consumer concerns or organized campaigns of disinformation. And we've come to know that all as what we would call coordinated inauthentic behavior. And there are the bad actors, the hate groups, the conspiracy theorists. They're very skilled at evading that being detected by hijacking memes and hijacking hashtags and things that are very quickly distributed across social media channels, right? So we actually had a session this week where we're speaking to a lot of thought leaders from Kinsen. And they shared that the needs for brands are, they call the ABC, which I thought was really interesting: action and behavior, and not just content. So spotting that is really, really important for them to take control again over the fallout of harm, I guess, just that early side of data.
So a challenge that I can see for a lot of organizations, whether it's the outsourcing community or the enterprise CX community, is recognizing the importance of trust and safety, but not having a program in place. And let's be frank, from what you've described, this is a very daunting problem for any CX environment. So what would your counsel be for whether, again, it's an outsourcer or a captive operator that wants to incorporate trust and safety, but doesn't know where to start? What would be the logical starting point for them to begin constructing a strategic program in this regard?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is realizing it is not the same as your CX work. So from a strategy perspective, I think that logical starting point is establishing expertise, and that will rarely be from a homegrown talent, because trust and safety at scale in terms of subject matter expertise is still relatively in its infancy. So this is new for everyone building, but it hasn't come with people having loads and loads of years of experience. I've been working in it for the last 3 to 4 years, and it takes that time to turn it around. The C-level commitment, Peter, is super, super important, because the trust and safety model will just look and feel and indeed get measured differently to anything that might be in an existing, say, a balanced scorecard or business processes. And that's everywhere. That's from hiring, understanding the skill sets you need for people, how to train, how to integrate well-being, a big topic in the trust and safety space. All of that being built into workflows are all areas that will probably require a redesign.
Yeah, and you bring up a really interesting point there in terms of the buy-in. It's got to come from very, very high levels to make sure that whoever is going to coordinate trust and safety is effectively going to have the mandate they need to make this happen. But that raises, I think, for me, another question, and that is, who is best placed, at least from a CX operations or a contact center perspective, who's best placed to actually handle these types of programs? Who's the right person to be tapped to run a trust and safety program
in the business? I think in terms of ownership, so first of all, trust and safety, it should be treated as a strategic design and strategic delivery. So whoever in the business has that level of focus, and it might differ across companies, right? But it usually starts in operations, because everybody focuses on what are we going to do? But they need to have a team that represents all business functions. To my earlier point about all those touch points in an agent life cycle, they need to be tailored and bespoke for trust and safety. So they need that team that represents everything, and they absolutely must have buy-in from the top. I think organizationally, getting alignment from senior stakeholders who might have limited understanding of that work can be an issue. And, you get instances of misapplication of policy, you get instances of not understanding what well-being should be, what training should be, because this just doesn't exist. There's no reference book to it. So they're often operating where the priorities are maybe the priorities for trust and safety might be misaligned with the organizational priorities that are existing, ratios of team leaders, pricing, even underdeveloped KPIs and scorecards. So people who work in these roles at the frontline level, Peter, they're really mission driven. They have a super, super strong moral compass. They like to feel that the impact and the social justice is something they're having a positive influence on. And this is driven a lot by the fact that effectively there's a big Gen Z population as well, right? So they want to make sure that the teams they have around them know and share those beliefs. And so leadership and C-level need to share those same beliefs.
That makes a lot of sense, logically speaking. And, one of the things I've been picking up on a lot is the fact that when we're talking trust and safety, there seems to be an impression out there that's driven by social media interactions. And I think, Paula, you and I have talked about this in the past. And I was mentioning there was a fantastic documentary that was done by 60 Minutes Australia that anybody listening can find on YouTube. It was really eye-opening about this issue, about how trust and safety on social networks is such a big thing. But is this really just a social network dynamic, or can, from a CX perspective, trust and safety incorporate other channels as well?
Yeah, I think there's a bit of a common myth, certainly in the current times, that it's still just a social media issue, and the only place that needs trust and safety support is if you're supporting those kind of platforms. I mean, it's certainly surfaced more visibly there and more virally, but gosh, there's so many examples I could probably give you. I mean, I think thinking about mainstream CX, think about e-commerce and the sale of online goods. Are they fake or are they authentic? Do they meet safety standards? Are the brand ethics substantiated? If you think about the advertising space, are people or businesses who they say they are? Are the details true? Is there fraudulent activity going on there? And another really good example is gaming. I mean, there's 2.8 billion online gamers recorded in 2021. That's a third of the world's population, and 20% of them are under 18. And then metaverse gaming predicted to grow at like 42% year over year for the next 5 to 6 years. So the impact of that is huge when you think of fraud, identity theft, child grooming and sexual exploitation, hate speech. I mean, you name it, it's all in there. And all of that rolls over into a CX space. So it is much bigger than just social media channels.
Yeah, and I think it's good that we're shedding some light on that, because unfortunately it's too easy to almost classify something in a narrow bracket or a narrow corner, when really the implications are a lot bigger than perhaps any of us have really thought about. And let's be frank too, Paula, in a lot of ways, we're finding more as we go along when it comes to trust and safety. There's no blueprint or handbook that's been written about it yet.
No, there hasn't. And I think that is where a lot of the misunderstanding comes from. But I mean, as consumers, so forget about even running a business practice, consumers, we live and breathe it every day. We see it every day. We hear the things every day. So just multiply that up at scale, and you know that you've got something which is really hyperscale, quite frankly. And you're right. I mean, also there's new things evolving every day. I mean, I just touched very briefly on metaverse, but like, everyone's getting super excited about that and doing lots of things. But you'll have seen some of the news reports over the last couple of days about allegations of sexual exploitation in a virtual space. I mean, how do you deal with that? How do you handle that? So it gets written fresh every single day. Something's new.
So last question here, Paula. And thank you very much. It's been absolutely fascinating in terms of a discussion so far. To finish off, can you enunciate what you see as maybe the major risks of ignoring trust and safety in the contact center environment?
Yeah. So I think, you know what, from a business perspective, it's just actually churlish to ignore it, just from the pure fact of its hyperscale and the market is growing. Indeed, I think the size of global content moderation solutions, it's already twice what it was predicted to be last year. But the risk of entering to it and doing it poorly, that shouldn't be taken lightly, because as I've said earlier, this is not a standard CX blueprint, and the expertise will take time and care. Operationally ignoring it though, Peter, it'll have an impact on the ability just to create great customer experiences in the current times in terms of what customers want and how they navigate, the digital space. But I think more importantly for me, it'll impact people. And I know I shared a little of this with you online yesterday, but we had a really recent example that has surfaced from some clinically led academic research that our wellness practice has completed that really looked closely at metacognition in the trust and safety space. And there is clear evidence on a need for a new approach to training and learning for Gen Z workforces. They're digitally native, they're socially and politically woke, they're willing to scrutinize policy and the status quo, really incredibly sharp critical thinkers, but their tolerance and engagement levels that they have got much shorter fuses. So how we educate, how we coach and engage that workforce is going to be very different to CX training designed over the last 5 years. This industry, I guess, is just in the earliest stages of development, and it has a long way to go with processes and policies and the tools to keep users safe. So ignoring it is not building that expertise early will become a problem downstream.
Paula, thank you very much for this insight and for your very noble work in what's becoming, I think, a mainstream issue, as it should be. And we wish you all the best as you continue in terms of making sure that consumers and agents are protected in the trust and safety environment.
Thanks, Peter. It is a fascinating space to work in, I have to say. So I look forward to see how you guys are watching it and observing it, and reach out anytime where I can help.
Thanks for listening to the CX Files podcast. We really appreciate your feedback and suggestions. You can reach myself, Mark Hillary, or Peter Ryan via LinkedIn. Please also leave a rating or review on your favourite podcast provider, as that helps more people to find us. As always, we'd like to thank Chris Haig at Traction Media for the CX Files graphics. See you next week.